All right, Lauren Villagran joins us here from the El Paso Times. She's a fantastic immigration reporter covering everything happening at our U.S. southern border. She's been on the show before. She joins us again. Lauren, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping back on the podcast with us.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Lauren, I purposely, because of you and our relationship with you, I purposely have ignored a lot of the news that has happened over the last couple of weeks with respect to the border. I wanted to kind of ask you a bunch of different questions, and here and there saw certain things, like the president obviously making a trip to our southern border, which hasn't happened in over a decade. For our listeners right now that are listening to the show, during the holiday break, obviously there was news that was happening at the southern border with migrants, and then you had the weather patterns that were freezing cold temperatures, and there's all these visual images of migrants sleeping on the streets. Can you summarize for our audience that's tuning in, like what is the latest and what happened during the last months over the holiday break with the surge of migrants, specifically in El Paso?
Yeah, sure. So it goes a little bit before that. I mean, you could actually go back many years, but I won't do that to you. But what I can tell you that El Paso has seen, certainly since the spring, summer, is ebbing and flowing of waves of migration to this particular border crossing point. And there are a lot of different factors that have gone into it. But to really kind of get to the point of what made El Paso a national story is that in late November, early December, the Border Patrol was encountering upwards of 2,500 migrants per day on average, which was just a historically high number and a number that made it very difficult for the city to absorb the needs that everyone had, because the majority of the folks who were coming were not folks who were crossing the border or sneaking over the border and trying to evade Border Patrol apprehension. They were literally waiting in line, hoping to seek asylum or some other immigration relief, and were being processed in and released to the community by Border Patrol. And El Paso has a long history of welcoming migrants. And we have a shelter network in the region that will take people in, give them a place to stay, a warm meal, and they would get on their way. But what was happening this past fall and into December is that folks were arriving who had no destination in the US. They didn't have a sponsor. They didn't even know where they were going. They had truly no resources. And so that put an increased burden on the city. And yeah, El Paso became a national story.
Laura, from just your reporting historically, you were alluding to a moment ago about, there's layers to this from a historical standpoint. In your reporting, just from what you understand, what seems to be causing this recent surge? Specifically, not just El Paso, but what we've seen in terms of the uptick of those seeking admittance into the United States.
I took a really big step back with my editor recently to try to answer that question, because it's so easy to get caught in the news cycle of the particular nationality who is arriving at the southern border, whether, last year it was a large number of Haitians. Before that, it was a large number of Central Americans. This year, it's been a large number of people from Venezuela, Cuba, and now Nicaragua. So, but if you take a way, way bigger step back, you have to look at the nature of border enforcement. That for decades and decades, it was all about Border Patrol apprehending mostly adult, almost entirely adult migrants, majority men looking for work. And so the entire border enforcement apparatus was set up to catch people trying to sneak over the border. Now, again, there's context there, because in the old days, so to speak, let's talk about like the 90s or the 2000s, you're talking about a majority of Mexican migrants who were coming. All of that began to change in 2014 when we saw the first wave of children arriving alone. Like, do you remember the unaccompanied minors? 2016, 2018, you start to see families arriving, mom, dad, small children in tow, babies. None of these folks fit the profile of somebody who was sneaking in. They were literally coming to the border, seeking protection, seeking relief from persecution, poverty, violence, so many different reasons. So remember, there hasn't been any overhaul of the nation's immigration laws since 1986. There was a small immigration reform in the 1990s, but nothing like the Immigration Reform and Control Act that a Republican president signed, that it was bipartisan legislation in 1986. And so the world has changed, the geopolitical realities have changed, and that means the needs of border communities, vis-a-vis the migrants who are arriving, have also changed. So fast forward to today, you're in a situation again where, I mean, guys, I was out on the border. I mean, I'm out on the border all the time, but when people were lining up, and, it was moms with babies in their arms walking through, the cold water of the Rio Grande and just waiting for hours and hours, sometimes overnight.
Hi, man. Hearing that, you're not the first, nor will you be the last correspondent that has traveled to the border and reported on it. And it tugs at heartstrings. Obviously, as somebody, a Cuban immigrant whose father came here in 1960 to escape what was happening in Cuba, like it tugs at the heartstrings. For me personally, I can't speak for Nick. I'm sure it does, because Nick's a human being. But Lauren, I do want to ask you about, speaking of another human being, President Biden was down at the border visiting border patrol agents and seeing things in El Paso. Then he went over to Mexico City. I want to play something for you real quick. Our friend Mike Emanuel, who hosts Fox News Live, he's the chief Washington correspondent for Fox News. He had Governor Asa Hutchinson on the Fox News Rundown podcast recently, and he was asking him about President Biden's trip to the southern border. I want you to take a listen to this. Let's react on the other side.
Do you worry President Biden's visit to the border is merely a photo opportunity designed to take away criticism coming from Republicans?
Well, I think it is. He didn't agree to go down there until the Democrat mayors started complaining about the disastrous border policy of this administration. So that was a wake-up call. But the Republican governors and others have been calling for this kind of border trip or a meeting with governors along the border states for months and months.
I would argue if anyone knows publicity stunts at the border, it would be Republicans. So obviously it takes one to know one. But that's just my personal opinion. It's not Lauren Villagran's. But Lauren, what is President Biden? What was he doing at the U.S. southern border? And now the subsequent days since he's gone to Mexico City to meet with the Mexican president, what has he been doing, and why was the trip on President Biden's radar?
I think we all know that the US-Mexico border is frequently used as a backdrop for politicians and elected officials. It just is all the time, whether it's the wall, whether it's other infrastructure. We in El Paso see politicians, both Republican and Democrat, come here to take that photo, right? That was the criticism, that it's a photo op. And you hear that criticism about anybody who comes. So, it may be fair. On the one hand, the Biden administration had actually already announced its policies, and DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas has been here many times. He was here just a few weeks ago. I had an opportunity to sit down with him and talk. So he had already reported back to President Biden what was needed, and we saw the announcement last week of the new border policies. Is it important to see with one's own eyes what's going on at a place? I think so. Now he came at a point where, again, immigration is this thing that, the tide rises, the tide ebbs in terms of people arriving at the border, how they arrive at the border, et cetera. And he came on a day when, there weren't any migrants left in the county migrant aid center that he visited. There were still migrants on the street. He did not go downtown, where there are still dozens of migrants who have not been able to be sheltered. And we can get into that in a little bit of why they haven't been able to be sheltered. Was it just a photo op? People will have their opinions about that. He did meet with the mayor. He met with the county judge. He met with the congresswoman. He met with the head of our food bank here, who is waiting for $500,000 in federal reimbursement. So I think it depends on who you ask. If you ask, the executive director of the food bank, was it a photo op? I think for her, she would say, I got to tell the president of the United States directly that we need funding for the work that we're doing here. But yeah, he got some photos at the border too.
And Lauren, on the subject of the president, obviously this is a multi-layered situation, and it's not one that's going to be resolved with this current administration, maybe not even the future one. But if you had an opportunity to sit down with the president, members of Congress, and really try to get a sense of where, or rather not even a sense of, but just in your view, from where you've sat at the border, the reporting you've done, what would be a potential just incremental step to improve the situation that's going on, potentially improve those who are going through this process of entering the United States? But in your view, like, what small steps could an administration like the one we have right now in place be able to do to alleviate the situation that's happening?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, the administration has just taken some important steps. I don't know whether or not, quote unquote, they will work. And, I have this conversation with my editor sometimes, like, what does what will work mean? I don't even think that as Americans, we have a solid answer of what we're looking for at the border. This is a funny thing, but I was looking at the last time the last times that presidents have come to visit El Paso. And I stumbled upon a visit by President Barack Obama in 2011. And he came and he did a tour very similar to Biden's. He went to the same port of entry. He saw the same kinds of things. This was, more than 10 years ago now. And he gave a speech calling for comprehensive immigration reform. And to listen to that, I teed it up on C-SPAN and was listening to it. And it was amazing how different the world already is. And it was amazing what the conversation was even just 10 years ago. The target continually shifts. Republicans have continued to call for the last 10, 12 years for additional border security. It was the same thing they were calling for during the Obama administration that Obama swore he delivered on: more Border Patrol agents, more technology, more wall, all of it. But it's never enough, it seems. And then again, the needs change, right? So what does border security look like when people aren't trying to sneak over the border? They are presenting and asking for refuge. We don't have a system that answers to that from a federal standpoint. So I'm not qualified, I think, to kind of pitch my ideas about what I think would work, but I can tell you what folks in El Paso say. So for example, Representative Veronica Escobar, who is a Democrat in the House, has legislation in asking for humanitarian processing centers at border ports of entry, where people could get in a line and make a claim. And a USCIS, a U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services asylum officer, or some qualified person could be there to evaluate that claim, and people would be in a safe environment. Variations on that idea have been pitched also by immigrant advocacy groups here. The former Republican mayor of El Paso is also on board with that idea. So one thing I can say as a border reporter is that I think that there are a lot of ideas and a lot of answers that can be found in border communities, not just Democrat border communities, but Republican-led border communities as well. History will show that the lawmakers of our great nation don't seem interested in sitting down and coming up with an actual solution to a problem that does win a lot of political points. I'm shrugging. This is
No?
this is my virtual shrug.
No, it's very well said. I want to ask you a personal question, but right after I ask you first about Title 42, because you were talking about some policies and measures, right? The Supreme Court upholding Title 42 currently in place that the Biden administration is still utilizing. I want to give our audience a little bit of a refresher on what I know Title 42, obviously, for people that have heard this term, and it was started during the Trump administration with respect to COVID policies and migrants that would be sent back because of healthcare measures. But now, with the Supreme Court upholding this, I would love for you to take our audience inside what that policy is still doing, because we've seen an influx, like you just mentioned before. So clearly, I'm not sure if the policy is working or not. I turn to you on that front. But also, I saw something with respect to Title 42 expanding specifically to three groups that you mentioned, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians as well. And I would love for you to kind of explain to our audience what that entails.
Yeah, so the new border policies are very much a carrot stick. But let's get into Title 42 first. It's kind of amazing to me that this kind of wonky 1944 public health law has now become a household name because of its use at the border. We know it's not really being used anymore for a public health concern. It was originally invoked during the Trump administration by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to prevent Border Patrol from holding people in congregate settings. That means like a Border Patrol holding cell. And that, I guess, made sense at the time, right? You didn't want, in a global pandemic, people crowded in border holding facilities. It's widely known that the policy continues to stay in place for reasons other than public health. And it's been the subject of multiple lawsuits, as you mentioned, one of which has reached the Supreme Court. So the Biden administration is continuing to enforce Title 42, which allows for the quick expulsion of migrants to their country of origin, or in some cases to Mexico. Mexico has agreed to take back multiple nationalities. Even before the new policies were introduced, Mexico has been taking back Guatemalans, Hondurans, Salvadorans, and under the new border policies has agreed to take back up to 30,000 people each month from Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Haiti. Those are really big numbers, I think. I mean, more people have come per month than that border wide, but when you think about Mexican border communities, which often suffer from a lack of infrastructure, investment, and are also frequently dangerous places, especially for migrants. You can imagine that if those numbers are met, that it could be really a lot of people and cause a lot of problems. So I think that in border communities, we're going to be watching closely for how that plays out for Mexico. In the policies that the Biden administration announced last week, Mexico agreed to take folks back, right? So we can quickly expel. That means if someone presents at the border to a Border Patrol agent, they're from Venezuela, they can be walked back over the international bridge in a matter of hours. Or in some cases, Border Patrol has actually been holding people and sending them to other cities along the border to make it more difficult for them to come back. That's kind of a different story. Okay, so what else did the Biden administration do? It agreed with Mexico to provide up to 30,000 additional visas for people from those countries. So folks can stay in country or in a third country and apply to enter the United States to get a visa and not expose themselves to the dangers of the journey north, or the violence and the dangers of Mexican border cities. But immigrant advocates say that policy, that the offer, it's up to 360,000 new visas this year, doesn't recognize the reality that many of these migrants face. Many of them don't have valid passports. They're fleeing countries where getting a passport is a matter, like, you either need a ton of money to deal with corrupt authorities, or you can't afford it, or the government is essentially collapsed. So will they be able to wait and download an app and make the application and have all their documents in a row? People who are fleeing for their lives don't necessarily have that luxury. That's the criticism. Mexico lauded the policy, said it was the largest expansion in labor mobility in the region in recent memory. I was really taken aback by how positive Mexico was about this, given the number of people that they've agreed to take back each month from these countries that, that are, these are folks who are not Mexican, right? Who they either have to integrate or deport. So, it's brand new. This just got authorized last week. And I think we're going to have to see in the coming weeks and months what effect it has on, hemispheric migration.
Lauren, before we let you go, a while back when you were on the program last time to talk about things happening at the southern border, we had maybe a subsequent episode afterwards where we started to do some fan feedback on the air, read in listener emails. And one of the emails mentioned you specifically and the episode we were covering at the time and how partisan sounding the journalists you had on from El Paso sounded. Now, I wanted to, in isolation, and I said on the episode at the time, that sounds like a you problem to the listener because of your ears and what you're hearing maybe from whatever it is, whatever silo or ecosystem, or echo chamber that you're listening to with respect to podcast, news, channels, et cetera. But you do such a great job. You know how much we admire your work that you're doing. I've seen you on CNN and C-SPAN and a bunch of other places covering this stuff. But you also live down there, right? You've mentioned last time on the episode, a 10-minute walk. You're at the border all the time. You could cross over to Mexico in 10 minutes. How tough is that, the personal side of this, covering this story, knowing that you live and work in the territory, and then seeing feedback like that where it's partisan, but you're a journalist, you're covering this stuff. What would you say to somebody that would be listening to this program that would hear Lauren Villagran covering things happening at the southern border? Do you feel you're covering it in a partisan way?
I get a lot of emails because I'm an immigration reporter, and that word immigration generates a lot of emotions. The border is a place that has been built up in the imagination of Americans as a place that for a lot of people really embodies their fears about what America is becoming demographically. The place where two nations come together is a foreign place for a lot of people. I live here, and I think people who live on the border aren't afraid of the border. That doesn't mean that everybody is in favor of letting everybody who shows up at the border in or keeping everybody who shows up at the border out. I think that border residents generally, again, in communities that may lean Republican, that may lean Democrat, you've seen the purple nature of the Texas borderland in elections recently, regardless of party. What I do think it's fair to say is that you will find on the border people who are more interested in the logistics and the practicality of border enforcement and immigration, and are maybe less caught up in the emotion around it. But I get a lot of mail, as I said, and I can tell you that as many emails as I might get that are sometimes filled with hate towards me or hate towards immigrants, I also get emails from people who are, touched by the very same story that somebody feels angry about. So it really, really, I think, depends on your lens. And the thing that I try to do in my work, I don't believe that in journalism you can always achieve the perfect 50-50 balance of perspective. But what I try to do is, in my body of work over time, address myriad issues that are important to a range of perspectives. So, for example, I have been covering in recent weeks asylum seekers who are coming this way. Coming up, stay tuned, I'm going to be looking at trends in ICE detention and try to investigate the administration's claims around expedited removal, that they're going to be removing people who don't qualify for asylum quickly. So I will be looking at that, and I hope that, while I certainly can't please all readers, that I do try to strike a balance. And Thankfully, I have earned the trust both of immigrant advocates in El Paso and elsewhere, and also the Border Patrol. I mean, I talk to Border Patrol agents on a daily basis, and they talk to me. So, yeah, I don't know what to say to your listener other than to keep reading and keep watching, um, and hopefully we can all learn things from each other.
I got a couple things to say, but
No, Nick. That will
sorry,
be.
you've been quiet.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no,
I'm
no.
talking a
I
lot.
made Nick be quiet on purpose. That's for the Patreon. Lauren, you do fantastic work. You know that here. You have a home here. We give a home here to journalists that are covering it, or we talk to people who know what they're talking about. Lauren Villagran, you could check out her work at the El Paso Times. She knows what she's talking about with respect to everything happening at our U.S. southern border. Lauren, can't thank you enough for coming on the program. Continued success to you, and please stay safe.
Yeah, thank you both. Take care.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.